health research and environmental design. And for the purpose of the recording, if this is your first time engaging with this seminar series, please do revert back to the previous seminars, which we had Harry Medley talk about artistic activism and sort of inclusive skateboarding scenes and leads, Ben Juster talking about green pressure, Brian Glenney philosophizing futures of skateboarding, and Roberto Enrique de la Selva talking about La Gaviota DIY and skateboarding activism. And I just think that list really demonstrates SSHRED is the place to be, and a very exciting place to be, sort of the forefront of a burgeoning skate scholarship, sort of reflecting a study of skateboarding that we hold so dear. Sort of, we have the list of names playing the game long before I was still probably learning my timetables. Our Bordens, Bills, Atencios, Holly Forbes, Naftali Williams, Indigo Willing, Brian Glenney, Sander, Chris, Ben, Vivioni, Ocean Howe, Duncan McDouira, just to name a few. A really exciting, excellent, and exoteric scholarship, amongst which we have some true titans. Of course, our Bordens, one of which I put Skateboarding Femininity, Danny Abuhawa's book up there. And I would also like to suggest that Paul O'Connor sits at the table of skateboarding scholarship titans, working on these texts that really stand above the rest. You know, just looking at skateboarding space in the city and skateboarding and femininity, to me, what really stands out for them is that, number one, they do the hard work for us. They really pull together all this important scholarship in these frameworks that you can just lift and apply to sort of the topic that interests you the most. And at that point, the hard work's done for you. They really capture skateboarding in the now, and they're really important beyond skateboarding itself. And although, of course, Paul's first monograph was Skateboarding and Religion, which was a extremely important book. I think, you know, any skateboarder would not necessarily, would also sort of liken skateboarding to a religion, perhaps a cult that we've found ourselves to be part of. You know, to be the author that brings these ideas together and expands on them is no mean task, but one in which I think Paul is the only author capable of doing in such a way. And sort of like going back from that book, Paul PhD was on hybridity in Muslim youth in Hong Kong, finished in 2009, of which sort of you can get a taste of what's to come, kind of foregrounding his philosophical, cultural, and sort of urban ambitions, sort of littered with little bits of skate references throughout. And since then, Paul has been a serial publisher of research and book chapters, a list too long to list in itself. Just three personal favorites of mine would be the discordant sounds and rhythm analysis with Brian, the hybrid elements of the city, which I believe is also with Brian, and the skateboarding philanthropy paper, also in the seminal text of skateboarding, edited by Cara Jane Lombard. But for me, the reason that I'm bringing Paul into the list of skate scholarship titans is the grey space concept. Now, of course, he worked alongside the SSHRED seminar series organizers, but it really, for me, does what skateboarding space in the city and the like do, really capturing skateboarding, sort of the post-Olympic skateboarding landscape. does the hard work for us. It brings together what's come before into this framework, which is so applicable to the state of skateboarding scholarship at the moment, and beyond, sort of situating it amongst leisure studies, which is reflective of Paul's call to paper, calls for abstracts for a forthcoming special edition of leisure studies, which Paul is going to talk about later. And if you are really excited about these ideas, I am also hosting a panel at Leisure Studies Association conference in July on grey spaces and polluted leisure, which I'll put in the chat in a little bit. So with that said, I will hand you over to Paul, who's going to talk about grey spaces and skateboarding, after which I will chair a Q&A for anyone who has questions. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Tom. That was really so flattering of you to talk about all of these titans of skateboarding scholarship. So thanks everyone for coming along today, wherever your time zone might be. I'm really pleased to be able to give you this talk because since we published the paper on skateboarding and the Anthropocene, there's been an awful lot of discussion and talk from colleagues, friends, peers about the grey spaces concept. And what I really want to do today is give you a kind of mission statement about what I conceive grey spaces to be, because Tom and I were in Croatia at the Vladimir Film Festival in September, and we organized a panel there on grey spaces. We also talked about grey spaces at the Stoke Sessions in San Diego, and I feel like a lot of the time I've been standing a little bit back from the concept in order to let people do their thing and kind of connect to it and respond to it. So I feel like it's timely for me to actually say, this is what I think of grey spaces. This is the conceptualization that I'm offering, and go for it, basically. Right, so straight to the point, get in there. What I've got here is a rundown of everything that I'm going to explore today, setting it out rather clearly so I can keep on task. I'm going to talk about where the concept really began, its origin, and the sort of path that it's taken. And I'm going to make some claims about how grey spaces power, or its kind of real contribution, is its simplicity, about how reductionist it is. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about material and symbolic elements, which I think are the most kind of grounding, anchoring aspects of the concept. Then I'm going to offer some methodological insights, which I'm actually pretty excited by. The methodological side of the concept, I think, holds an awful lot of potential. And then I'm going to, in a little bit more of a kind of cautious way, I'm going to talk about some potential frames for grey spaces as possibilities where the concept might be applied and where it can go. And then lastly, talk about chromatic leisure. So fairly straightforward. I'm going to progress through these and keep it reasonably clear where I'm heading and what's actually going on. So let's begin really with the origin here of the concept. Where did it all come from? So back in 2017, I took a field trip to Shanghai as the Vans Park series was taking place, and I was basically trying to look at the Vans Park series through the frame of the emerging topic of the Olympics and skateboarding, and to also try and connect this to the sport idea of mega events. I wasn't really sure what I was going to find. What really surprised me, what kind of blew me away, was the environmental issue surrounding this event. This skate park that you can see in the image was constructed over about 10 days, and it had a wooden framework and then California skate parks sprayed the concrete base onto it. And as soon as the prize giving was completed, and Nora won the women's event, and she kind of snuck back into the skate park and tried to have a skate. She was kicked out because they were demolishing the skate park that evening. So it only had 2 days of actual skateboarding. It only had 2 days for the event, and then it was destroyed. 107 yards of cubic concrete was sprayed, and this site was taken because it's kind of beautiful. You get to see the whole Shanghai skyline. And I was shocked, basically, thinking how important skate parks are as a resource for communities, how much we want to have places to skate. And this was kind of destroyed very quickly. And I thought something's going on here. And it was around about that time, you know, that Clifton was doing his special issue on lifestyle sports in Southeast Asia and that kind of thing. And we were talking a little bit about polluted leisure, because I've been a huge fan of his polluted leisure concept. And he was encouraging me, like, you know, do something with skateboarding. Then in Pushing Borders, we actually met. Sander encouraged us to sort of put together all those people that were interested. Clifton came along, Indy was there, Brian was there. There was a whole bunch of us academics and activists who were also taking part. And that's really the origin of the SHRED seminar series, right? That was where we all kind of put our hands up and said, I'm interested in this. There's something about skateboarding, the environment, pollution that we need to address. So we kind of all decided we were interested, and then we realized we were all going in different directions. So we talked about some different ideas, and eventually what happened is I just kind of ran with the frame of skateboarding in the Anthropocene and brought in Indy and Brian, and of course Clifton, who's so kind of encouraging with the polluted leisure frame. And we made this paper. And the kind of conceptual anchor that sort of complements Cliff's polluted leisure frame is that of Greyness, the way in which skateboarding operates in the material space of greyness, and skateboarding also is symbolically grey as an ambiguous, contested term. And that seems to be like the kind of really helpful way to begin thinking about grey spaces. So from a polluted leisure point of view, I think it is exquisite the way that it makes sense to me, and it seems to be endlessly relevant. So just this weekend, it was rainy in Exeter. So when I met up with my weekend crew to go skateboarding, we couldn't get to the skate park, but we've got this tunnel that's kind of near the airport where we can go and skate if it's too wet. It's kind of like the only dry space in the city. But you can see, like, this is a super gray space materially, right? Because it's dark and it's just concrete, asphalt and steel railings along the side. But at the same time, it's gray in the polluted sense that, you know, this is a horrible place to skate. It's full of fumes. The car fumes come straight under there. And that's a lot of what we're doing in skateboarding. And Cliff talks about this through the work of, I think it's Laura Wainwright, the kind of way in which we lean into pollution and we make accommodations. And it's kind of very interesting way to start thinking about the way we skateboard. We're always skateboarding in these polluted spaces. So that's part of the greyness. And at the same time, there's something else going on. And I've spoken a lot with Brian Glenney about this, because Brian points out that often skate parks are in really, really beautiful contexts, that they're in green areas, they're in kind of blue areas, the green and blue leisure things that we'll get onto later. Certainly, when we were skateboarding in Croatia again, there was a DIY that was in the middle of the woods, which was just gorgeous, really nice, kind of natural environment. And there was also a skate park right by the Istrian Sea there. It was kind of really enjoyable places, so they don't feel very gray. This image that I've got here is of the Morrison Hill Skate Park in Hong Kong, and you can see that big green central place is actually the skate park. You can't even see the skate park from this angle because it's such a plush area. But at the same time, you can see all the traffic, again, creates a very polluting environment while the skate park is right next to a huge amount of fumes. And in the 30-degree heat and the 90% humidity, that's a really unpleasant, polluted environment to be in. So taking the pollution issue a little bit further, Brian's recent paper really connected with this gray issue and polluted leisure. And he kind of basically said polluted leisure is gray. He makes the argument that there is this chromatic idea to polluted leisure. And what Brian did remarkably, he kind of ran with this idea and found 25 Superfund brownfield sites in which skate parks have been built. So we've got the material idea that skate parks, skateboarding is taking place in the polluted urban landscape. And we've got the symbolic idea as well that skateboarding is sometimes ambiguous. And these two are sort of brought together and compounded in this argument where skateboarders are used as that ocean howl gentrifying sweeping brush and pushed into these polluted areas. Skaters always want to have skate parks, and the concrete cap of a skate park on top of a brownfield toxic site makes the connection between pollution, leisure, and the kind of grayness of skateboarding really elegant, right? It demonstrates it really beautifully. So fundamentally, these ideas, the kind of framework that enabled me to start really thinking about gray spaces, comes from Cliff's idea of polluted leisure, and it seems to expand from that point. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today is actually saying, well, this is where it begins, but there's also an awful lot of really relevant stuff where we can kind of widen the idea of how gray spaces connects to other themes as well. So that's where it all began. And again, this is part of the inheritance of that very original discussion that we had at Pushing Borders back in 2019, okay? So the next point I'm going to make is this reductionist point. And this relates to the fact that in a lot of the discussions that I have with some of you, actually, there's often a joke about grayness and gray spaces, and people often play around with the idea because it's so simple, right? And I think that that's what's really interesting about this concept, is that grayness applies to everything. You can pull anything into it, which is fun, but it's also problematic, because if a theory doesn't have any real purchase, if it stops making insightful and useful insights, if it doesn't contribute to knowledge, then it ends up not being a truth generating concept, right? It doesn't do anything. So there is this tension here, which a kind of simple idea is actually really useful. But here I'm referring to Brian and Steve's article on skateboarding and the ecology of urban space. And they make this claim: skateboarding exists in a plurality of kinds, and in so being, it is sui generis of its own kind, a claim that we defend, talking about ecological context. So this is a really important point. The fact that skateboarding is sui generis, that it's unique, actually makes it really complicated to talk about. So talking about skateboarding is very difficult. Writing about skateboarding is very difficult because it is plural. And again, this kind of connects with my ongoing academic interest, which is in plurality and hybridity. And so grayness really captures that same thing, that it's a middle space, a liminal space, a hybrid space, a plural space. So if part of the issue with skateboarding is that it's really difficult to talk about, then claiming that it is unique becomes a really nice default way to stop having to connect it to other things. And this relates now to the work of Mircea Eliade's historian of religion, and he basically makes the same claim about religion. It says religion is sui generis, that it is unique and it can't be described by anything else other than religion. And so he develops a whole bunch of religious language, from the numinous, hierophany, axis mundi, to use specific religious language to discuss religion. So Eliade is basically an anti-reductionist. He wants to claim that there is something so unique about religion that it cannot be reduced to anything else. I totally reject that. I think that that's really unhelpful. And whilst it's interesting and helpful to say that there is something unique about skateboarding, I think it's really important to reduce it, to make it accessible so we can discuss it, and also so we can use the insights of skateboarding research and skateboarding theory beyond skateboarding itself. Otherwise, and this is part of my concern, if we don't simplify, we're not reaching out to others. And we're basically having a siloed conversation, an echo chamber, where skateboarding researchers talk to each other and they don't really reach outside of the field. So I think that's really critical. And that's what I want to make a clear point and say, that in conceptualizing gray spaces and making this mission statement, I think that one of the things that is really critical is that we recognize that the simplicity of the term is intentional, and it's used as a way to connect and make dialogue with not just other skateboarding scholars or other scholars in lifestyle sports, but other scholars just widely across the broad range of all fields. Skateboarding research, if it's going to be academically legitimate, has to also contribute more broadly. It has to make theory from within and apply it to spaces beyond. Okay, so that's the reductionist issue taken care of. The next point is to just give you a little bit more juice, as it were, on the material and the symbolic. I think this is a component part of what we're looking at when we play around with the gray spaces concept, is that these two ideas, both the material and symbolic, are really helpful to ground and anchor the concept. Now, there is something probably facile about this, that just about every material thing has a symbolic component to it. That's not to say that we're ignorant of that when we're playing around with the concept of grayness, but more importantly, that we should consciously lean into this and make it distinct. I think this is also very relevant because what it suggests fundamentally is that work on skateboarding should have a qualitative component. And I think many of us have done literature reviews and we've searched for work on skateboarding, and we found this risk-centric epidemiological research concerned about broken bones and abrasions and injuries. And that's often very scientific and positivist. And it seems to miss something if it does not engage with the world of skateboarding and the comprehension of skateboarding by skateboarders. So I think that this engagement with a qualitative component, the material and the symbolic, is essential. I think that that's what we're doing when we're playing around with skateboarding studies. I've got Ian's book cover here because it, as always, you got to go back to the foundation, and Ian sort of covers everything. Even if he hasn't used the same sort of terminology, he's touched upon it in some way. So this image is a gray image, and it's a beautiful gray image because it's absolutely, resolutely urban, and it demonstrates what we understand an essential component of gray spaces to be: the urban environment, that materially urban environment. And at the same time, we've got the image of the skateboarder, which is anonymous. It's actually a symbol. That's an outline. It's an icon. And I think that that kind of resonates here with the issue that the symbolic element, what actually happens in skateboarding with the gray space, and it's exactly what Ian discusses throughout the whole of this text, is that interplay. So we're dealing with the meaning making of space and how that ends up being so critical. So let's talk a little bit about how that unfolds. So I know Clifton's here in the audience here. So Cliff invited me up to Newcastle to come and have a look at the waste DIY, and he's doing some really interesting work there with his polluted leisure research. And I like coming back to this photo, and it's very evocative also of many different DIYs, right? So you'll recognize this in the Grove, for example, or other DIYs around the world. And it's something that Mike Jeffries spoke about too, is that DIY spaces are important ecological places because they allow this wilding of space to sort of unfold. But this is kind of an ambiguous space because you've got an urban enclave here, and you've also got the encroachment of the natural world, the wild world in the same space. And the waste DIY again leads into this ambiguous space because the foliage around the DIY actually helps keep it secret and off the map and make sure that people aren't too aware of it. So there's an awful lot of very valuable stuff when we play around with the actual idea of what ambiguity, grayness means, and then the sort of material way it unfolds, this way in which the urban and the natural environment become this in-between space to also hide the covert work of skateboarding, because this is a covert practice. You're not allowed to use this space. This isn't legitimate space, and we recognize how skateboarding is often in a gray area between what is legal and what is illegal, what is a sport and what is delinquent activity. So yeah, this kind of image is very, very helpful, and it's also kind of useful for us to recognize that a lot of good work coming from the kind of gray spaces paradigm, or a lot of good potential, is connected to DIY spaces. So Tom's work on the Grove has been kind of really nicely connected to this. And also Tom's work looking at the kind of the sport for good, the impact of social enterprises in skateboarding also exists in a gray area, a contested area in which there are many concerns about the political intent of skateboarding as a social impact. Also, the last talk here from Roberto, looking at the Gaviotto DIY. I don't think I pronounced it correctly. All very relevant. So it also seems interesting that this year, when I've been thinking more about this interplay between the gray and also the sort of more colorful sides of skateboarding, I've come across a whole bunch of videos that really brought home that skateboarding isn't simply gray. And it's like, well, that's something I want to address for you all now as well. I don't want to simply think that skateboarding only exists in gray space. This is a photograph that Hannah Bailey has taken. It is included in her short film, A Land for Everyone, which I've included a link to at the end of the presentation. And this is of skateboarder Lindsay McLaren. Again, and for Harry's interest, if you look at the sign there, it's a passing place. So come to that in a moment. This is an intentional activity. They wanted to go out into the Highlands in Scotland and find a beautiful place to skate and be part of the landscape, to be included, to be part of this much bigger, larger, powerful, natural context. And so it's easy to look at this and say, well, you know, that kind of undoes the kind of gray spaces idea, because again, skateboarding takes place in so many beautiful environments where there's plush greenery, but fundamentally, Lindsay is skateboarding on asphalt, right? The material is so hard to get away from. Skateboarding is always in this location. Also, I had really great privilege of working with Barney Page and Ryan Sherman on their documentary Land's End, which tells this amazing story of Barney deciding to skate from John O'Groats to Land's End to raise money for the Ben Ramers Foundation, again, during the COVID pandemic and the kind of ambiguous rules in this country, at least, about where you could be and if you could go outside and how you could travel. So he did this remarkable thing with very little preparation and was very determined. And what's so interesting about this documentary is it shows an awful lot of greenery, shows an awful lot of the natural environment. And yet it's this punishing road that's always there, the grayness of the road, and also the kind of threat of not just the pollution, but these enormous vehicles that are always trying to get past Barney as he trying to makes his way down the country. The grayness kind of also connects to this dark situation, the issue of mental health, suicide awareness in skateboarding. And I think it's a really kind of beautiful context to sort of pull in between the symbolic and the material again, how skateboarding does this thing. It kind of expands our emotional and spiritual ideas about the context. Lastly, got to include Harry Zenders here from the Passing Places video, Joe Allen's video. And this is another great example of how I was reminded again that there is this gray space, but it does connect. And in this context, Harry is skating right by the sea here, by the blue sky and the blue water of the sea and the sand, and yet still finding a way to connect with the gray space there. So basically what I'm trying to deal with in talking about material and the symbolic in this concept is that the symbolic is really essential, just as the material is unavoidable and kind of almost like the gravity of the concept at the same time. It's not to suggest that all skateboarding is dull. It's to suggest that skateboarding exists in a plural space. That's what I really want to get across. So in this sense, I'm becoming somewhat more oriented towards the symbolism in social research and thinking more about the ideas of psychoanalysis and archetypes and things like that. So in what way can we play around with what gray truly symbolizes? And by, again, getting simple, I think that we're able to connect with some really, really powerful ideas. So in this sense, grayness is that middle place. It's the place of plurality. Even though it might appear dull and lacking color, it's where colors combine. And this is the kind of context that is made through this combination. So more can be said on this, but I'm going to move on right now and talk about the methodological aspect. Basically, skateboarding has tended to not be particularly conscious about its methodological innovation. I think this is really relevant when you consider the seminal work of skateboarding. So think of Becky Bill's qualitative research, ethnographic research with skateboarders, and also think about Ian's Skateboarding Space in the City. In terms of methodology, both of those articles, well, Becky's articles and Ian's book, don't necessarily make a new methodology, but they end up applying and embracing skateboarding methodology, using skateboarding to inform their methods. So in Becky's case, she actually got close to a group of two different groups of skateboarders and used those skateboarders to employ a kind of participant verification process with her research. But essentially what she actually did was she became two different skateboarding crews and she hung out and talked skate an awful lot. So that mirrors what skateboarders do in urban space all the time, which is they build these little social networks and they negotiate between themselves what skateboarding is and what skateboarding means, because skateboarding is fluid, plural, and it's always moving. Ian, rather interestingly, and if you've gone through Skateboarding Space in the City in detail, you know that what actually Ian's source material is a lot of the time is this huge array of skateboarding magazines and old video. And so he's done exactly what skateboarders do. Skateboarders' primary source material is skateboard media. They read magazines, they discuss through their own skateboard media, they discuss through videos and now increasingly social media, and they communicate their understanding and negotiate their ontological reality as skateboarding through the negotiation of media. So I think basically a lot of skateboarding research hasn't been aware that there is an internal methodological process that we have been generating. And I think through Grey Spaces, we have the opportunity to make that more distinct. So in terms of qualitative methodologies, about oblique methods that are sort of parallel or tangential to typical methods, one would a walking interview or the literary or process of doing an exquisite corpse type of methodology where people contribute and unfold understanding of a context. I want to turn to a couple of examples where there has been methodological innovation in skateboarding. Vivoni has done this great contribution by talking about below the knee method in which skateboarding embraces. When we look at photography, when we look at video in skateboarding, it occupies a below the knee reading of public space. But at the same time, uses below the knee to also give a sort of symbolic edge to what's going on in skateboarding. That skateboarding is often regarded to be spectacular, leaving the ground, making its way into the heavens. But so much of what skateboarding actually does is connect with the quotidian, the everyday, the ground, right? The material aspect of the ground. So therefore, looking at skateboarding is looking at space below the knee. And so Duncan has done an amazing job of sort of really running with this, and he takes the below the knee method and applies it to skateboarding as an ethnographic tool and talks about rolling ethnography. Just like there's a walking ethnography, you can do a walking interview or you can do a walking ethnography. Skateboarding is rolling ethnography. A lot of the work that we do as researchers is actually in situ on our boards, observing, taking on board what's happening, literally taking a central reading of what's happening, using our perspective public space from the board and below the knee to understand the lives and realities of skateboarders. So therefore, I'm hoping that Grey Spaces can also give us a way to recognize that the methodologies of skateboarding are oblique, they are tangential, they are also often a little bit ambiguous, moving in new directions and being plural in the way in which they address their subject matter. We have praxis in skateboarding. A lot of skateboarder researchers are skateboarders themselves, and therefore they have this access to knowledge that is already unique. So in this point, there is a material issue again, and issue that we employ in our methods. I think there's something about skateboarding research, and skateboarding research that omits the qualitative is missing something very significant. Apologies if my internet connection is a bit unstable. And the next thing that I kind of really want to take from that is to say that there's potential here to think about being methodologically prefigurative. So I think that's what I'm trying to say with the skateboarding praxis and also the research process, so that they are connected in some way. And if I'm really honest, I read kind of early seminal work of both Borden and Beale as being methodologically prefigurative in the way they engaged with skateboarding, that it used skateboarding as a culture and a method to perform the research. What I'm hoping is that as a research group, we can become more conscious of this, and we can actually start to make overt contributions to the methodological process, again, which Vivoni and Duncan Maduri-Ra have actually been sort of found in the way there as well. Okay, so I've made my methodological statement. What I'm going to say now is less well defined, and I'll talk about it very briefly, is just gray spaces as frames. There are a number of different ways that we can work with gray spaces and frame them in order to, I guess, develop new sorts of work. One of the ways in which I think this is relevant is to look at identity, particularly the ways in which skateboarding in a gray spaces frame can acknowledge the alternative or the marginal identities, whether they are gender, sexual, ethnic, political identities. They can certainly be encapsulated in this frame. Issues of work, I think of Gregory Snyder's Skateboarding LA. There's something really interesting going on in skateboarding and the sort of grayness, ambiguity of what is actual play and what is actual work. I think we as scholars in skateboarding recognize that ambiguity, and I think it's even more potent for those professional skateboarders who are trying to make a living out of skateboarding at the same time. And there's a great deal of lack of clarity, shall we say, about payment and obligations and responsibility. I think that there's something to be said about tourism. I'm interested in the different chromatic types of tourism. I've always been interested in pilgrimage, dark tourism, thanatourism. Certainly the pink dollar talks about the idea of different sexualities and tourism. And I think there's something about gray tourism, the way in which skateboarders tour around and go to different places. I'm going to jump over sound. Gray literature is something that you can see as being related to underground publications, and I'm going to zero in on times. I think this is really relevant to my own research interests in looking at older skateboarders. So gray skaters, older skaters, he's looked at this, Esther's looked at this, and not as a scholar, but Josh Sutton, who's done this image here of the old skaters crossing the road with the board. They've all kind of connected with the way in which skateboarding later in life, or coming to skateboarding later in life, is a really rich area of discussion that, again, draws on the material as the graying hair, but also the ambiguity that people experience later in life, where their roles are often challenged. Esther does a great job of talking about this in terms of the way in which your identity as a woman changes as you get older, and in some ways you become less visible, and how skateboarding transforms that and actually gives an opportunity to challenge that notion of what you should be doing and how you should be read and understood as a body. What I really like about this paradigm as well is it gives us an opportunity to expand beyond skateboarding. Belinda Wheaton's work on Silver Surfers really connects with this idea of active aging. But we can go further. This is what I'm really interested in. Gray nomads, but also gray time relates to what we're currently dealing with. And my research on older skateboarders in the UK at the moment is really invested in the fact that we're dealing with a very unclear time in this country, and it's ambiguous, it's frightening, and it's really not very cheery. Again, always the material and the symbolic. So lastly, I'll talk to chromatic leisure. I like this image because this bowl on Bondi Beach is a nice blue bowl, and it's right by the beautiful blue sea, and it kind of plays with this concrete material of skateboarding again in another beautiful environment. So much of it has been concerned about well-being and the value of green and blue spaces. And really our contribution as scholars to adopt a gray spaces paradigm is to challenge that and say that there is something not necessarily salubrious about green and blue spaces, and there's something misleading about the way they're conceptualized when we are always performing leisure, as Clifton says, in a polluted world, right? So this sort of challenges that way in which chromatic leisure is always turning the debate on sport and leisure towards health and well-being, and how that has become increasingly aligned with the natural environment at a time in which we are dealing with environmental collapse. So again, the chromatic turn is something I feel that we can all contribute to. And the point being here is that it doesn't necessarily take away the rainbow of colors that are so relevant, but it provides an opportunity to draw them into a middle space and to discuss them in that frame. So, in conclusion, Greyness is not simply to reduce skateboarding without purpose, but it is intended as a method to capture its plurality, its hybridity, its diversity, and its color. Gray space as a concept allows us to be methodological in our study of skateboarding, use skateboarding to generate theory and concepts, and also connect beyond skateboarding. So I'll finish off there and remind everyone that we have a call for papers for our special issue on the leisure of gray spaces, urban play, and the chromatic turn. You can see that on the SSHRED blog. And I also have a few sources that I refer to, not all of the sources that are relevant for this, but definitely some which I refer to directly that are worth having a look at if you're interested. So thanks everyone for your patience. I think I talked for longer than I expected, but that's my conclusion. Thank you.